My outdoor summer project this year is building a cedar privacy fence in my backyard. I wish I could say it was a happy story, but my sister has terminal breast cancer, and the plan is for me to be inheriting her 2 German shepherds, and I need to make sure that my yard is fenced in before that happens. We don't know how much time we have left exactly, but her doctor recently told us she has less than a year. This project took a lot of planning and started with using string lines to get a rough outline of where I want the fence to be. After marking off the corner posts, I then marked out the locations for each post with white flags. The 3-foot deep cutouts in my fence were a requirement of my homeowners association. I ordered all of my materials online from Menards, and they were delivered to my driveway just a few days later. The delivery driver was awesome and even helped me get most of the materials delivered into the garage to avoid moisture from any rain. Since I knew building a fence would be a huge undertaking, I decided to hire someone to dig all the post holes and set the posts in concrete for me. After having 811 mark all the utilities, he used a skid steer to dig all the holes in one day, and then he and another guy set all the posts another day. The post holes were 9 inches in diameter and 30 inches deep, and each hole took 1 to 1.5 bags of concrete. With all that done, it was time for me to start building. I first attached some string to each corner post at 6 feet high and made markings on all the posts at that height. I also marked where each of the rails would be placed, so I don't have to figure that part out later. Using a string line allows you to make sure the total run of the fence looks perfect. So this mark here at the top is where I want to cut off the top of the post, and then these 2 marks are what show where the top rail is going to go. So I made a jig that will fit over the post, and I can put the top right at the mark where I want to cut. The distance from here to this surface is the same distance from the blade to the plate on my circular saw, so I can come in on both sides and cut off the top. The jig made cutting the posts pretty easy, just repetitive. And I eventually set the circular saw so it wouldn't quite cut through the post all the way. That way I could come back with a handsaw and very easily remove it, and not have to worry about the top of the post falling off and denting my bald head. This video is not sponsored by anyone, but there are a few things I highly recommend if you're going to build a fence, and a cart is one of those things. This Gorilla cart was really nice to have for almost every step of this fence build, and you'll see more of it throughout the video. Next, I added a top board that connected from post to post. I used 2x6 cedar for this top board, but I should have ordered 2x8s instead, as it turned out the 2x6s weren't wide enough to give the look I intended. Most of this build, attaching all the boards and cutting them to length, was repetitive, but still easy. The next step was attaching all the rails. I used cedar 2x4s, and each section gets 3 rails. So I took the same picket that I was using for all the measurements,
So I added some pocket hole screws and screwed on some scrap cuts from just some of the leftovers that I had here from building the fence, and also put a top cap here so that I can hang it. That way when I come by with all the rails, I can just rest one end on the little arm here, and I can hold the other end and screw it in. Makes it a lot easier for when you don't have somebody else to help you. Now before I can start the next set of rails, I have to use the circular saw to cut right in the middle of the post and cut off the excess rail from before. This top one I can never get through just because the top board here gets in the way of the circular saw. So there's always just a little sliver hanging on, and I can use this oscillating saw to cut through it.
After the bones of the fence were up, I had to go back and add pickets. I went with a board over board style so that there wouldn't be any gaps in the fence, giving total privacy. And having the top board in place made installing the pickets easier because I could just butt the top of each picket up against the top board and nail it in place.
Well, if you want to see a wood boring insect, this picket I just put up has one sticking halfway out of it. But you can see the hole that he ate through right there, just a perfect circle. And actually, if you look at the one right next to it, there's one where he got all the way through. So at this point I've gotten into a pretty good rhythm of putting up the pickets. I made a little spacer out of a partial picket. I just ripped it down on the table saw and cut it to 3 inches, and I put a couple nails in there just to have something to hang it on the rails. So I can hang it up here on the rails right next to the previous picket that I put on and kind of hold it in place while I set up my next picket. Put that tight to that piece and then lift it up to the top where it hits that top board, and I can tack it in place in the middle. So now I don't have to hold it. Take that piece out, put it on the other side, and go with the next picket. And after every 3 or 4 pickets, I'll go back and check them with the level to make sure that they're plumb. And I can kind of knock them into place a little bit and then tack them in. Same thing. And then every now and then I'll go back and do my second row. And for this, I just basically hold up the picket over the gap and center it. Looking at the dog ears up top makes it the easiest to center. I can tack it in place here, so now I'm not holding it. It'll still swing a little bit, and just make sure that the gap up here is the same thing all the way down so it looks like it's plumb. And I use 6 nails on the outside edges of this outer picket because they'll actually go through this picket and the one underneath it and then into the rails.
This DeWalt nail gun I'm using really is a must-have. I think I ended up shooting around 3,500 nails throughout building this fence, and I had the gun jam on me maybe 2 times. And even then, the nail gun has an Allen wrench on it that can be used to loosen 2 screws and take the gun apart enough to clear the jam quite easily. It's not a cheap tool, but having a reliable nail gun makes building so much less frustrating, and that is totally worth the money in my opinion. When it came to building the gates, my plan was to build a box out of 2x4 cedar and then nail the pickets to it once it was already hung in place with the hinges. I went with half-lap joints to make the frame nice and strong, and then assembled the four sides with Titebond free glue and screws. I then added a cross brace by placing it under the frame from corner to corner, and then tracing the edge with a pencil. I cut this out with a jigsaw and then attached it to the frame with more glue and screws. It's important that the cross brace runs from the bottom of the hinge side to the top of the handle side of the gate, so the brace is in compression and not tension. This will help prevent the gate from sagging over time.
So on the back side here, this hole is where one of the bolts for the hinge will come through. And since it's not going to have anything substantial to grab onto other than a picket, I cut a 2x4 that I can just place right up here and secure to the framing.
Once the hinges were up and allowing the door to swing freely, I continued the board-on-board style of pickets and added the rest of the gate hardware until it was completed and able to latch closed. And I have to give a special thank you to my dad for not only coming over to help with putting up rails and pickets, but also for being a second set of hands when putting up some of the gates. The last step was to stain the entire fence. There are a lot of options out there, but I went with Ready Seal and used their natural/light oak color. I'm using my Graco X5 sprayer to apply the stain, and this is the same sprayer I used in a previous video where I completely redid my solarium. The sprayer teamed up nicely with the Gorilla Cart and made it really easy to pull everything along with me as I sprayed. I have a little less than 300 linear feet of fencing, and it took 26 total gallons of stain to finish both the inside and outside of the fence. Although costly, this was a huge improvement in the aesthetics of the fence, and it'll make it not only last longer, but also prevent the fence from weathering and turning gray. In certain areas, I used plastic taped to 2x4s to try and better contain the overspray, particularly when spraying near my house or toward the neighbor's garage or driveway. It was a clunky solution, sometimes defeated by the wind, but it mostly worked how I needed it to. I've still got a bunch of work ahead of me fixing all the bare spots in the yard now, and I also have to landscape this little cutout to comply with my HOA. But I'm so happy with how the fence turned out, and I think it looks great. It actually makes the backyard feel bigger, I think just because it puts some definition on it. And I know that Calvin and Henry will love being able to run around and play out here.